across-the-board cuts that come from the sequester. President Obama says, quote, "We can't cut our way to prosperity." U.S. Senators gaveling in here on C-SPAN 2. Thanks for the calls. We'll take you live to the Senate floor now.
Mr. President,
Senator from Illinois.
ask consent the quorum call be suspended.
We're not in a quorum call.
Madam President, as everyone in the Senate knows, people across the United States, with the sad passing of Senator Daniel Inouye in December, there were a number of changes that were made in the Senate Appropriations Committee, a committee which Senator Inouye skillfully chaired until his passing. He also chaired the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, which served our nation, and did it with the kind of a leadership that only a person with his distinguished military service could give. With this unfortunate change of events, I found myself unexpectedly in a new role as chairman of the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee. I never would have guessed it 2 months before that it was even in the realm of possibility. Given this new role, I thought it was appropriate and worthwhile during the recent recess to take a first-hand look at some of the things our military are doing in an often overlooked part of the world, in Africa and in the nearby Gulf. Before I go any further, let me note how impressed I always am on these trips that no matter where we go, in any corner of the world, there's an outpost of America's finest, our diplomatic personnel, serving on the front lines and representing the best of our values. They are often joined by American development and military personnel, helping improve the lives of host nation populations, providing training and security in the area. I want to thank all of the ambassadors, their staff, and others who made great personal sacrifice to make my recent, short, quick visit a great success. My first stop last week was Uganda, a good friend of the United States located in a difficult neighborhood in Central Africa. Many know that Uganda was recognized around the world for its early efforts to stem the spread of AIDS at a time when many other African nations were in complete denial. Some of that progress has waned over the years, but there's been a renewed effort to rebuild on earlier success. Uganda is also helping to lead negotiations with various factions involved in the violence in eastern Congo, also known as the rape capital of the world. Last year, the armed rebel group M23 overran key parts of this eastern Congo, bringing further human suffering to an already scarred part of Africa. I want to acknowledge the constructive role that Uganda has played in moving these talks forward. Uganda is also home, originally, to the horrific actions of the Lord's Resistance Army, an army group led by a messianic and violent warlord named Joseph Kony. Kony and the LRA's brutality were once again in the spotlight last year when the group Invisible Children launched an online video detailing more than 20 years of brutal LRA violence, including murder, rape, kidnapping, and the dragooning of child soldiers. To date, this video has had almost 100 million viewers. In Uganda, I had the chance to meet with two impressive people who were victims of the Lord's Resistance Army. They witnessed some horrific acts. One young man met with us at the ambassador's residence. This Lord's Resistance Army invaded his village, dragged all the young men out, put them in a circle, and said, "You're about to become soldiers in the Army. Before you become soldiers, though, you'll be asked to kill your family." Many of them couldn't believe it. This young man said he was praying they'd spare his father. They brought his father in front of him and murdered him as the child looked on. Then he was brought into service for 6 months, roaming through the jungles, fighting on behalf of this Lord's Resistance Army until there was an opportunity for him to escape. He's turned his life around. It's hard to imagine anyone could after those horrible experiences, but he has. Next to him was Lily, a beautiful young woman. She, too, was kidnapped by the Lord's Resistance Army and forced into unspeakable things for the time that she was under their control until she, too, escaped. The good news in both of those stories is they've made a life since then, and they've tried to help others who have been victimized by this kind of kidnapping. These horrible things are occurring in Africa, and we have decided to help. With the Ugandans, we are working to put Joseph Kony and the Lord's Resistance Army out of business. We have pushed them out of Uganda. We now believe that they're in the Central African Republic. In 2010, Congress passed a bill led by a former colleague and a great champion of Africa and a former friend and colleague of the presiding officer, Senator Russ Feingold of Wisconsin, called the Lord's Resistance Army Disarmament and Northern Uganda Recovery Act of 2009 an important step forward, and it was. I was proud to co-sponsor the bill. As a result, last year, President Obama, because of the Feingold legislation, sent 100 U.S. military personnel to help the Ugandan Army track down and bring an end to the Lord's Resistance Army menace. I met in the bush with our military in Uganda who were following up on this Feingold legislation. I can't tell you what a remarkable job they're doing under very difficult circumstances. The LRA is on the run. Defections are increasing, and formerly terrorized communities are starting to live without fear. There's still more to be done, but I was impressed and proud of how the United States stepped up and is doing something that will be remembered for generations by the Ugandan people. Let me also take a moment to mention another issue in Uganda. There is a proposed law pending before the Parliament in Uganda that would literally criminalize homosexuality, in some cases even imposing the death penalty. This is a cruel piece of legislation that has been met by global condemnation and concern. I met with the activists in Uganda who fear for their personal safety if this bill becomes law, a fear that I believe, unfortunately, is very warranted. I and others have appealed to the Ugandan government not to tarnish its international reputation and impose criminal penalties against people simply because of their sexual orientation. Uganda must continue to be a leader in the region, something this legislation will substantially erode. I hope that ultimately common sense will prevail and the Ugandan parliament will not pass this terrible legislation. Madam President, while few have ever heard of a small, hardscrabble country in the Horn of Africa called Djibouti, it is one of the most strategic pieces of real estate in the world. Tens of thousands of ships pass through the nearby shipping lanes every year. Over 30,000 vessels, 40% of all the ocean traffic in the world, passes this point. And the country is surrounded by violence and instability, including Yemen, just 17 miles away, and Somalia, their next-door neighbors. We're fortunate, therefore, to have Camp Lemonnier located in Djibouti. It is a significant United States military base helping to bring security and stability to a difficult neighborhood. It's not an easy location to do business. In the summer, temperatures reach 120 degrees. There's not a tree in sight in Djibouti. The country is extremely poor, and opportunities for recreation and escape are almost non-existent. These American servicemen and women are to be thanked for their dedication and long tours away from their family and friends. They're playing an important role in bringing greater security to the region and helping dramatically reduce the scourge of piracy that has so impacted the area waters in recent years. USAID also has a major humanitarian distribution warehouse in Djibouti where emergency food aid can be shipped quickly and efficiently throughout the region as far away as Bangladesh. And even in faraway Djibouti, there was a woman from Illinois helping with this effort. I want to recognize her work here for a moment on the floor. Her name is Christine Karpinski. She is from Chicago, and she's part of this important USAID effort to save the lives of the most vulnerable people in the world. Let me lastly note that Djibouti just had elections this weekend. Elections the opposition is claiming were fraudulent. I wasn't there as an observer, but certainly Djibouti can do more to open up its political system. It took some notable steps with the current election, and I hope the post-election process can move forward in a peaceful manner. I also hope that the Djibouti government, in partnership with the United States and other foreign powers that have significant footprints there, will do more to lift its own people out of poverty. What I saw there in terms of underdevelopment, particularly given the sizable sums paid by foreign governments for base leases and a population of less than 1 million people, simply didn't add up. We in the government of Djibouti have a responsibility to do more for the people who live there, especially the next generation of young people. Uganda, Djibouti, so many countries in that region, you will find 50% of the population under the age of 15. It's just a reminder to us that the forces, the dynamic forces behind Arab Spring in many parts of the Middle East and Northern Africa are at least evident in many of these other countries that haven't been touched yet by that change. Lastly, Madam President, I had the opportunity to visit the small Gulf nation of Bahrain. It's been one of the more open and forward-thinking countries of the Gulf region. It's also a close U.S. ally, home to the U.S. fleet, and located in yet another difficult neighborhood bordering Iran, just across the straits. Bahrain has been a generous host to our Fifth Fleet, and anyone who's had a look at the map or followed tensions with Iran knows the importance of such a naval force in this part of the world. These dedicated sailors help keep shipping lanes open and ensure that Iran does not threaten its neighbors or U.S. interest. Their presence alone is likely to make Iran think twice about reckless moves in the Persian Gulf. Let me say a word about the Navy. I guess I'm partial because my two brothers, my late brothers, both served in the Navy during the Korean War. So when I get a chance to go aboard ships, I visualize my older brothers and what life must have been like in those days. When I went out with Admiral John Miller to visit some of the ships of the fleet, I met some of the finest young men and women you could ever ask for. Most of them had been trained in Illinois at Great Lakes Naval Training Station, and now we're off serving the United States Navy around the world. No one, unless they have some experience and knowledge of the subject, could understand the enormity of the responsibility which these men and women in the Navy have. We often hear about the heroic efforts of those who are in the Army and Marine Corps and Air Force, and I certainly don't want to take anything away from them. But the important, life-saving, peacekeeping jobs being done by the U.S. Navy, particularly the Fifth Fleet that I visited, cannot be overstated. Bahrain, incidentally, is going through its own domestic difficulties. It experienced its own Arab Spring in early 2011, one that started with peaceful protests calling for a more open political process. That process unfortunately broke down and many demonstrators were killed or jailed. Others, sadly, were tortured. The government of Bahrain did what few other countries in the region would be willing or brave enough to do. They created an outside commission to look into the issues around the uprising. A blunt and sober report was issued, and it's my hope the government of Bahrain will abide by its many recommendations. At the same time, I hope the opposition will seriously explore the latest attempt at dialogue offered by the government as a means to address the current political impasse. Bahrain has so much promise and can continue to be one of the shining lights of the Gulf. Both sides must renounce violence and work toward a peaceful political solution. Mr. President, let me also note, Madam President, let me also note an overarching theme noted on this trip, one I've mentioned before on the Senate floor, the role of China. Everywhere we went, we heard time and again how China is everywhere, often at the exclusion of American businesses, investment, and influence. This pattern cost us not only lost jobs, but lost diplomatic and security engagement. That's why last year, Senator Boozman and I introduced a bill to create a coordinated U.S. strategy to boost U.S. exports to Africa and in turn foster American jobs. This bipartisan bill cleared the Foreign Relations, Banking, and Finance Committees, only to be held up at the last minute at the end of the year by Senator Toomey of Pennsylvania. And to his credit, he didn't do it in a secret manner. He came to the floor and objected. Though I disagreed with him, I respected the fact that he stated his point of view. I would like to sit down with him again and any others who are skeptics about this legislation and let them know what I saw on this trip. Delaying the passing of this legislation cost us more than lost influence on the continent and jobs here at home. It really is going to be a squandered opportunity. Think about this. In the last 10 years, the 6 fastest growing economies in the world were in Africa. In the next 10 years, 8 of the top 10 will be in Africa. Where are we? We are playing a distant second fiddle to China. What does that mean for the future? It isn't very encouraging. It's time for us to step forward and show real American leadership in this area, and I appeal to those who have opposed this Africa trade bill, which Senator Boozman and I have sponsored, to take a second look and reconsider their position. Madam President, it was an honor to visit our dedicated diplomatic, development, and military personnel. It was a reminder of the importance and indispensable contributions to U.S. policy that they still play around the world in improving lives and ensuring security. These investments abroad are not only symbols of American generosity and values, they make the world safer for everyone. We should keep this in mind when we consider that America's foreign assistance budget, one that includes maintaining all our embassies around the world, is just over 1% of the total U.S. budget. Madam President, I yield the floor. And before I yield, I ask consent that any remaining time between now and 4:30 be equally divided. That time which is in quorum calls be equally divided between those supporting and opposing the vote at 4:30.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President.
The senator from Maryland.
I ask consent to speak as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Madam President, I have the honor of being the chair of the U.S. Helsinki Commission, representing this body in that commission. That's a commission that was established in 1975 in order to implement the U.S. responsibilities in the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Its membership includes all of the countries of Europe, as well as the former republics of the Soviet Union, Canada, and the United States. The main principles of Helsinki is that we are interested in each other's security. But in order to have a secure nation, you have to have a nation that respects the human rights of its citizens, that provides economic opportunity for its citizens, as well as the defense of their borders. We also have partners for cooperation, particularly in the Mediterranean area, that use the Helsinki principles in order to try to advance security in their region. During this past recess, I took the opportunity to visit that region on behalf of the U.S. Helsinki Commission. I was joined by several of our colleagues in looking at the current security issues. Our first visit was to Israel, and our main focus, quite frankly, was in Syria, as to what is happening today in Syria. In Israel, we had a chance to meet with the Israeli officials, and it was interesting as to how many brought up the concerns about Syria. They were concerned about Syria's impact on Israel's neighbors and what was going to happen as far as security in that region. While we were there, there was an episode on the Syrian-Israeli border, and the Israelis provided health care to those who were injured, providing humanitarian assistance. And we thank the Israelis for providing that humanitarian assistance. It was interesting that the Israel officials pointed out the concern about the refugees that are leaving Syria, going into neighboring countries. We know the vast numbers. There's almost 1 million Syrians who have left Syria because of the humanitarian concerns for other countries. About 250,000 have gone to Jordan, about 280,000 are in Lebanon, 281,000 in Turkey, another 90,000 in Iraq, and 16,000 in Egypt. Well, Israel's concerned about the security of its neighbors, concerned about how Jordan is dealing with the problems of the Syrian refugees, how Lebanon is handling it. And we know the concerns about Hezbollah operations in Lebanon and how that is being handled with the Syrian refugee issue. We had a chance to travel to Turkey when we left Israel. We met first with the Turkish officials in Ankara, and we got their account as to what was happening in Syria and what Turkey was doing about that. We then had a chance to visit the border area between Turkey and Syria. We visited a refugee camp in Kilis, where there's about 18,000 Syrian refugees. We also had a chance to meet with the opposition leaders that were in that camp, as well as later when we were in Istanbul meeting with the opposition leaders from Syria. I mention that all because the humanitarian crisis is continuing in the country of Syria. This Assad regime is turning on its own people. Over 70,000 have been killed since the Arab Spring started in Syria. While we were there, the Assad regime used Scud missiles against its own people, again killing Syrians, killing a lot of innocent people in the process. This is a humanitarian disaster. I want to mention one bright spot, if I might. We had a chance to visit the camp, as I said, in Kilis, on the border between Syria and Turkey, in Turkey. And we had a chance to see firsthand how the Syrian refugees are being handled by the Turkish government. And, Madam President, I want to tell you, they're doing a superb job. I think it's a model way to handle a situation like this. They have an open border. Now, the border area at that point is controlled by the Syrian freedom fighters. They control that area. But their Turks allowed the Syrians to come in and find a safe haven. The Turkish government has built housing for the refugees in the camp. We had a chance to see their children in schools. They're attending schools. They are getting proper food and proper medical attention. They have the opportunity to travel where they want to in Turkey. Freedom of movement. They have the opportunity to go back to Syria if they want to go back to Syria. So the Turkish authorities are providing them with a safe haven and adequate help. And they're doing this primarily with their own resources. There's one other thing we observed when we were in this camp on the border. We had a chance to meet with the elected representatives of the refugees in Kilis. They actually had an election. They don't get that opportunity in Syria. They're learning how to cast their votes. They're learning what democracy is about. They're learning what representation is about. And we had a chance to talk to these representatives about the circumstances in Syria and what we could do to help. First, I want to point out that there is still a tremendous need for the international community to contribute to the humanitarian needs of those that are being affected in Syria. There are approximately 4 million Syrians that are in need of humanitarian assistance. There are 2.5 million internally displaced people within Syria. The United States has taken the lead as far as humanitarian aid, having provided $384 million. Other countries have stepped forward, but quite frankly, more needs to be done. In talking with the opposition leaders, and we had a chance to really talk to them in depth when we were in Istanbul, they expressed to us a sense of frustration. A sense of frustration that there hasn't been a better unified international response to the humanitarian, to the actions of the Assad regime, to what the Assad regime has done to its own people, and to get Assad out of Syria. Quite frankly, they understand, or at least we explained, that some countries might be willing to provide certain type of help, other countries may not. As you know, the United States has provided non-lethal help. Other countries are providing weapons, other countries are providing training. But we need to coordinate that. And the absence of coordination provides a void in which extreme elements are more likely to get into the opposition. And that's something we all really want to make sure it doesn't happen. So, Madam President, the message I took back from those meetings is that the United States, we need to be in the leadership of coordinating the efforts of the opposition. We made it clear, and I think the international community has made it clear, that Assad must go. And he should go to The Hague and be held accountable for his war crimes. He has no legitimacy to remain in power in Syria. That's been made clear, and we underscored that point again. We also underscored there is no justification for any country, providing assistance to the Assad regime on the military side. And as we know, Russia and Iran have provided help. That's wrong. That's only adding to the problems and giving strength to a person who's turned on his own people. But then we need to coordinate our attentions so that we can provide the help they need and the confidence that they're looking to, so that they will have the necessary training not only to reclaim their country, but then to rule their country in a democratic way that respects the rights of all of its citizens. As the chair of the Helsinki Commission, I pointed that out to the Syrian opposition, that we want to provide the help so that they can rule their country one day, we hope sooner rather than later, in a way that respects the rights of all of its citizens, provides economic opportunity for its citizens, for that's the only way that you're going to have a nation that really respects the security of its country. That was the message we delivered, and I hope that the United States will join other countries in a more concerted effort to get Assad out of Syria. As I said, I think he should be at The Hague, held accountable for his war crimes, and held accountable and allowing the people of Syria to have a democratic regime. And with that, Madam President, I would yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Georgia.
Madam President, I rise today, this year, 2013, on the 10th anniversary of the State of the Union address by President George W. Bush when he introduced a program known as PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Program for AIDS Relief, a program that has had remarkable success in the last decade. A lot of that success has taken place on the continent of Africa, from where I've just returned after my 7th trip in the last decade. A trip where remarkable things are happening all over the continent in terms of AIDS infection being reduced, mother-to-child transmission being in fact eliminated in many cases. And the biggest challenge today about those who fall victim to AIDS is not that they will die soon, but the continuum of care necessary to see to it they live a normal lifestyle with the antiretrovirals provided by PEPFAR. But I think it's very important for the American taxpayer, the American people, and those of us in Congress to recognize what's been achieved in the last decade. For our taxpayers have invested billions of dollars on the continent of Africa to begin the process of trying to eliminate AIDS. We cannot yet declare victory, but we can declare great victories in battles along that way. And we're making more and more of them every day as more and more African-American males are getting tested. African-American females are getting tested as they should. We have mothers getting the care they need with antiretrovirals during their pregnancy to prevent a transmission to their baby. And we're seeing a continuing progress of the great program that was started 10 years ago by this Congress, by President Bush, and by the American people. We are beginning to send the message we need to let the African countries know that scaling down our investment and raising their participation at the government level is important to seeing to it that PEPFAR remains a viable program. In our visit in the past 7, 8, 10, now 9 days, I guess it was, we visited the Congo, we visited Mali, we visited Senegal, we visited Morocco, and we visited South Africa. In each and every country, they're beginning the process of having more and more of their health professionals taking care of more and more of the responsibility of caring for people, testing people, and distribution of the ARV antiretrovirals, which lessens the pressure on the budget of the United States of America. But I think it's important to recognize that a disease that we feared was going to take much of the population of that continent, and ours for that matter, 10 years ago, is now a disease that's being managed, being reduced, and over time we hope to have a generation free of HIV/AIDS one day, not only in America, but around the world. But there is a troubling thing happening on the continent of Africa and in Asia, and it's been those who are taking the volunteers that come from our country and other organizations and actually stopping them for giving inoculation and vaccination to the people. In Pakistan and in Afghanistan and Nigeria, those are the last 3 countries on earth where polio still exists. Just a few weeks ago in Kano, in Nigeria, 9 workers were killed trying to give vaccination to children in Nigeria because Islamic leaders in those countries had tried to tell them that American donations of polio vaccine would in fact cause them to be impotent when they grew up to reduce the Arab population, which is furthest thing from the truth. But it's a wives' tale that's being told to eliminate or to keep vaccinations from getting to people that need them. In the country of Pakistan, since December the 12th, there have been 5 attacks on workers distributing vaccines to try and eliminate polio in Pakistan. So as we celebrate the victories of vaccinations in terms of HIV/AIDS, in terms of polio, and in terms of malaria and other diseases, we have to also recognize there is still ignorance in some parts of the world that are prohibiting people who will ultimately get sick and die from getting the vaccines necessary to prohibit them from contracting those difficult diseases. So I come to the floor today to recognize the great achievement of the American people in the war against AIDS on the continent of Africa and the creation of PEPFAR by President George W. Bush, but also to send out the warning call for those that are still trying to prohibit the vaccinations and the antiretrovirals from getting to the people that need them in Nigeria, in Pakistan, and in Afghanistan. Because one day we want a generation free of HIV/AIDS and disease, not just in the continent of North America or the continent of Africa, but around the world. So it's a great tribute to the American taxpayer, the American medical community, the researchers and developers, and the American people, and this Congress, that the war on AIDS is still being engaged, that we're declaring victory after victory on the battlefield, and that one day the hope of a generation free of AIDS may actually happen, not just in America, but around the world. And I yield back the time and note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
The Senate continues in a quorum call at 4:30 this afternoon. They will vote on the nomination of Chuck Hagel to be Defense Secretary. Earlier today, by a vote of 71 to 27, they agreed to move forward on the nomination, so that vote coming up at 4:30 Eastern. Earlier today in the party lunches, the leader of the Senate, Harry Reid, Democratic Majority Leader, and also Republican Leader Mitch McConnell both spoke about the impending sequester, those automatic budget cuts set to happen on March 1st if Congress doesn't act. We'll show you what we can as this quorum call continues.
Just indicated the Senate will vote today for a second time to move forward on the nomination of Senator Chuck Hagel, a Republican to serve as Secretary of Defense. 12 days ago, Republicans mounted a first-of-its-kind filibuster to Senator Hagel's confirmation. Senator Hagel is the first nominee in the history of our country who's been selected by the President to be Secretary of Defense to have been filibustered. And what has the filibuster gained my Republican colleagues? 12 days later, nothing. Nothing has changed. 12 days later, Senator Hagel's exemplary record of service to his country remains untarnished. Mr. President, I can still remember visiting Senator Hagel in his office. I don't remember what we were there to discuss. There was something dealing with Senate business. And he had in his, as you walked into his office, a picture of two young men on a mechanized vehicle in Vietnam. And I asked what that was, and his staff indicated that's the Hagel brothers and their time together serving in Vietnam. They had both been wounded more than once, Senator Chuck Hagel, and he also is credited with saving his brother's life in Vietnam. This is the person who's going to be the next Secretary of Defense. I repeat, his record of service to his country is untarnished. 12 days later, President Obama's support for his qualified nominee is still strong. 12 days later, the majority of senators still support his confirmation. Senate Republicans have delayed for the better part of 2 weeks for one reason: partisanship. At a time when our nation faces threats abroad, and that's an understatement, the President's nominee for Secretary of Defense, there's a fair and constructive confirmation process. Politically motivated delays send a terrible signal to our allies around the world. And they send a terrible signal to tens of thousands of Americans serving in Afghanistan, other parts of the world, and those valiant people who are serving here in the United States. For the sake of national security, it's time to set aside this partisanship. In 3 days, across-the-board cuts to defense spending are scheduled to take effect. The Pentagon needs a seasoned leader to implement these cuts. Democrats are working hard to avert the worst of these arbitrary cuts, cuts for which an overwhelmingly majority of Republicans in Congress voted. The so-called sequester, Mr. President, was supported by 174 Republicans in the House of Representatives, 28 Republicans here in the Senate, 60% and 75% of the two Republican bodies in this Congress. We have a balanced proposal to replace those across-the-board cuts for this year with smart spending reductions, which must continue, measures that close corporate tax loopholes and wasteful subsidies, and revenue from the very wealthiest among us, Americans making millions of dollars each year. It's critical that Republicans and Democrats come together to find a balanced way to avert these drastic cuts. The consequences of the so-called sequester cuts are real, not only for our national defense, but for millions of American families and businesses alike. 750,000 jobs, 750,000 jobs, Mr. President, are at stake. Across the country, tens of thousands of teachers, including thousands who work with disabled children, could be laid off. 70,000 children would be dropped from Head Start. 375,000 adults living with serious mental illnesses and children dealing with severe emotional problems will go untreated. Airports could close due to a shortage of air traffic controllers and other essential personnel. And lines at airports that do stay open will stretch out the door as TSA workers are furloughed. At McCarran Airport in Las Vegas, Mr. President, last year, more than 40 million people used that airport, coming to visit the bright lights of Las Vegas Strip, downtown Las Vegas. Those lines are going to get longer, waiting to take off in Las Vegas. That's too bad. And from coast to coast, hundreds of thousands of civilian employees of the Department of Defense will face furloughs that will devastate their families and devastate our economy. These cuts will take place. Now, Mr. President, on Friday when this kicks in, it's going to, not everyone's going to see these cuts on Saturday, but they're going to kick in. People who run these agencies, people who run the Pentagon, I met with the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff right before we left for our break. These cuts are going to take place. They're going to be felt with defense more quickly because the civilian agencies have not rehired the people that they could have, and they've done other things. Because of the essential nature of what the military does, they haven't done that. The cuts in the military are going to kick in more quickly. The other cuts are going to not come immediately, but as the weeks move on, you will see more and more people who have been hurt in the non-defense fields. The effects are cumulative, and they're going to hurt. They're going to hurt really bad, Mr. President. We want to work with Republicans to come to a balanced, responsible way to reduce this sequester, the impact of it. But my Republican colleagues are standing in the way of a solution. They only want cuts and more cuts. They are willing to sacrifice 750,000 American jobs rather than ask multimillionaires to pay a penny more. Mr. President, 56%, almost 60% of Republicans around the country support this balanced approach that we have. Republicans, I repeat, around the country support this, in addition to the independents and the Democrats. The only Republicans in America that don't support this balanced approach are the Republicans who serve here in Congress, in the Senate and in the House. Mr. President, 3/4 of Americans, I repeat, including almost 60% of Republicans, are crying for a balanced approach. With only 3 days left to protect America.
What is the parliamentary situation?
The Senate is in a quorum call.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the quorum be vacated.
Without objection.
And Madam President, what is the pending business before the Senate?
The Senate is considering the Hagel nomination.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that I may speak as if in morning business for approximately 10 minutes.
Without objection, the Senator from Maryland.
I thank the presiding officer for granting me that permission and my colleagues. I was so excited when I came in because I have a new desk in the Senate. With seniority, I've now moved to the row where giants in our institution once stood. This is a particular seat where just a few weeks ago was held by John Kerry. But though my desk location is new, I come to the floor with what seems to be a persistent pattern in the United States Senate and in the United States Congress, which is when faced with big problems that affect the fate of the nation, let's delay, let's blame, and let's not get to the work that the American people elected us to do. I rise today to speak about sequester, something that was never, ever meant to happen. It came out of the dark days of the debt ceiling debacle in the summer of 2011, where we were facing the downgrade of the United States economy and a dysfunction of the United States Congress. And in order to kind of get us to the table, we came up with an agreement to have a super committee that would meet on both sides of the dome to come up with how we could begin to solve the serious fiscal issues facing the United States of America. There was an insistence, yes, by one side of the aisle that we have a trigger, and yes, the President looked back on history, and what we have here now is a situation where we said what we would propose as a trigger if we didn't get our act together, which we have not. We would put into place something so serious, so draconian, so unthinkable, so unworkable that we would solve the problems through a regular order and find that sensible center that Colin Powell has so often talked to. Well, you know, the super committee collapsed. Not because it wasn't the great efforts of people like Senators Murray and Durbin and other members over on the House, our very own Maryland, Chris Van Hollen. So then we were faced with New Year's Eve. So we put it off till New Year's Eve and after the election. And here we are, while people were wearing funny hats all over America, we were doing funny things. And what did we do again? We put off sequester for 2 months, again not solving the problem. Well, now we have a rendezvous. On March 1st, sequester will happen. I'm opposed to sequester. I think it's bad policy for our country. I think it will hurt our economy. I think it will exacerbate the fragile job situation we have, and it will affect not only government employees, but those who work because in private sector jobs because of the federal government. I support what was originally intended, a balanced approach that would look at increased revenues, particularly plugging up tax loopholes, particularly getting rid of tax break earmarks, along with strategic cuts in spending and a review of mandatory spending to see what else that we could get more value for our dollar. For me, I'm going to speak tomorrow about the impact on science, technology, innovation, and jobs. Today, I want to speak about my own beloved state of Maryland and the people who work there. Mr. President, Maryland is the home, not only to the Super Bowl champions, but to Nobel Prize winners, and also people who work every day to help create the jobs today and the jobs tomorrow. I have the honor of representing 130,000 federal employees, and they say, wow, how many of them can we get rid of? Well, why would we want to get rid of the people who work at the Social Security Administration? These are the people who calculate the eligibility of the benefits in regular Social Security and in disability. Why would we want to get rid of anybody working for the Federal Drug Administration who every day are analyzing clinical trials to see if they can be moved to pharmaceutical or biotech or medical device production, ensuring that when they come out into clinical practice, they are safe, they have efficacy, they can be taken by the American people, and we can export them around the world? Why would we want to get rid of anybody at FDA that's helping make sure that our drug supply is safe? And how about the food inspectors? Right now, one of the turbo engines of my Eastern Shore economy is seafood production and poultry production. You can't have poultry production unless you have food inspectors. Now, when we start laying off or following food inspectors, it's going to affect those private sector jobs. If you don't have an inspector, you're not going to be able to have those companies working at the same level of production. Hundreds of thousands of more work because of the federal government, like iconic contractors, particularly in defense, and also like at NASA Goddard, which is our space science center. Yes, 3,000 civil servants, but there are thousands of contractors. And what are they facing? Layoffs, furloughs, pay cuts, lousy morale, and what are they worried about? Their future, and they wonder whether they should give us another future. Make no mistake, we are not only going to hurt our economy, but there is an anti-incumbent fever, developing around the country. Now, as we look at solving the problems, there are those who want to protect lavish tax breaks or tax earmarks for a few. I want to stand up here for the many. Not only that people who are multimillionaires or billionaires can take a tax deduction over their corporate jet. I'm for the people working every day right now to find the cure for Alzheimer's, to find the cure for autism, to find the cure for AIDS, to find help for the arthritic. And most recently, not only what is done by government, but even where they're done in private institutions. Within the last few weeks at Johns Hopkins University, under federal help from the Veterans Administration, on an American war veteran from Iraq who had lost both arms, Hopkins was able to perform surgery that did the first successful arm transplant. Doesn't that bring tears to your eyes? And that happened because of the genius of the Hopkins personnel, with help, financial help from the VA, to do the kind of research to make sure the surgery was a success, but the autoimmune suppression was. This is what the American people want us to do, to not only help that veteran, but what we learned through the VA will also then move into civilian clinical practice. I'm telling you, Mr. President, we've got to really come up with a solution that where government is doing a job to help the American people with compelling human need, or America is doing a job that enables other people to keep their job or protect their livelihoods, like weather. You know, people watch the Weather Channel and say, oh, isn't that guy Cantore great? I love Cantore. We even tweet each other from time to time. But Jim Cantore and the Weather Channel get a lot of their information from the National Ocean and Atmospheric Agency. That's the agency in Maryland that runs the weather forecast for all of America, predicting hurricanes, tornadoes, and it also ties up with the global weather prediction system that protects our ships at sea, civilian, cargo, military, as well as whether airlines can fly or not. So when we look at our legislation, we have to know that there are real consequences to those employees. The numbers sound a lot, but their contribution to saving lives and saving livelihoods is enormous. And then if we look at compelling human need, does the American people really want to protect people not paying taxes on their second million over Head Start? You know, if sequester goes into effect, we're going to have a terrible effect on special ed. In Maryland, special ed teachers would be affected, and it would be an across-the-board cut in education. The same with Title I. Maryland would lose over $14 million. Federal law enforcement, something I know you are very keenly interested in. If the sequester goes into effect, it's going to affect over 1,000 federal agents. That's at the FBI, that's at the Drug Enforcement Agency, that's at the Marshal Service. You know, we don't know a lot about our Marshal Service, so they serve so quietly and efficiently. You know what the Marshal Service does? They protect our judges in the federal courthouse. You remember how some have been shot and wounded. It also serves warrants for runaway fugitives. And you know what? It also enforces the law on sexual predators in our country. Do we really want to furlough these men and women? I don't think so. And then there's the FBI. The FBI is crucial, not only in mortgage fraud, financial fraud, but in now the world of cyber. Do you know that last year in America there were 300 bank robberies? That's a terrible number if you're one of those banks, but there were thousands of attacks on by cyber, on our American financial institution, of which the FBI was prime time. Do we really want to lay them off? No, I don't think so. There's another issue of safety, and that goes to aviation safety. You know, I'm really deeply concerned about the cut in air traffic control, furloughs, layoffs, or asking even fewer of them to work longer hours. We can't have it. And when we think about law enforcement, it's also like border control. You know, I'm for comprehensive immigration reform, but I'm also for protecting American borders. We now have 57,000 border control agents. Surprising number. If sequester goes in, we could be forced to lay off or furlough 5,000 of them. You know what a furlough is? It says to someone who's willing to be out there in the desert, facing those who trade in the illegal traffic of people, guns, or drugs, while you're out there in that hot sun, you're in harm's way, putting your life in danger, we're going to ask you only to work 4 days a week, and we're going to furlough you 1/5 of the time. Mr. President, for that border control agent being furloughed like that, that's a 20% cut. And I will say this, if the federal employees are going to take a 20% cut and furloughed, we should take a 20% cut. I think I should be treated like my Social Security employees, like my NIH employees working for cures, like FDA, the food inspectors, the people inspecting cargo coming into the port of Baltimore or looking for illegal cargo coming into our airport. If they take a hit, we should take a hit as well. And I look forward to moving on that legislation. But I hope we don't get to that point, not for me to protect my pay, but to protect their future and to say America believes in what you're doing, and we want to protect you so you can do your job for America instead of protecting all these breaks for billionaires. Now, people can say, didn't we do the tax break thing? Didn't we do the tax break thing New Year's Eve with Biden and McConnell? Yes, it was a down payment. But there are lots and lots of very juicy loopholes or tax breaks. Tax breaks for sending jobs overseas, tax breaks for deductions on corporate jets, Do we need those? Those are really earmarks. A tax earmark goes to a people in a particular class, and it lasts indefinitely. While we're waiting for comprehensive tax reform, let's go after some of these and come up with a balanced approach on revenue. Mr. President, I know you were a governor, so you know about bond ratings. Well, in Maryland, my state of Maryland and my large counties are going to be affected by sequester because as the federal government goes, Moody's rates our bond rating. Maryland could lose millions of dollars and have to pay high interest rates on bonds. This is going to have a terrible impact, particularly in the area of school construction. It will cost hundreds, if not thousands, of jobs in not building schools we need, or roads that need repair, or water systems that need to be upgraded. But people say, oh, well, that's government. That's the way it is. Well, you know, Mr. President, I just want you to realize that if in fact people begin to lose their jobs or get furloughed and lose a big part of their income, they're not going to be spending money on the local economy, the real economy. But it also means they won't be giving to their charitable organizations. It's regretful. But if you have less money to spend and you save it somewhere for your family, you're not going to be giving to the United Way, to that great federal campaign. The lab assistant at NIH who faces losing her job isn't going to give to the charitable fund. The customs official at Thurgood Marshall Airport isn't going to have the same disposable income to make sure that they give again to the United Way. Mr. President, we've got to stop sequester. Now, on Thursday, I will be joining with my colleagues, my Democratic colleagues. We have a plan. Our plan is simple and straightforward. We come up with $86 billion. Half of that is in revenue. What does that mean? It means we come up with money for the Buffett rule. Its origins was in Warren Buffett when he said he should pay the same rate of taxes as his secretary. What that means is that on his second million, not his first, we believe in entrepreneurship, the job creators, etc., but on his second million, he will pay the same rate as somebody who makes $55,000 a year. The other is we want to close a loophole on sending jobs overseas. For too long, we have rewarded the export of jobs when we should have a tax code that rewards the export of products, whether it's our great pharmaceutical industry, our art, protecting intellectual property, and so on. So, Mr. President, we come up with that, and then we have a cut in the farm subsidy program where we will no longer pay people not to plant. That will be about $27 billion. And then, yes, we do cut defense, but that doesn't trigger until 2015 when our troops are home from Afghanistan. We never want to put, through our budget problems, put our troops into harm's way. So, Mr. President, I just wanted to share, you know, what's going to happen. In my state, we represent many great federal iconic agencies that moved to Maryland during the 30s, 40s, and 50s when real estate was so high in Washington, D.C., or just not enough land. I'm so proud of them. They win the Nobel Prizes. They help us win the markets. They're coming up with the new jobs today, the new ideas for the new jobs tomorrow. Or they're out there like the Coast Guard, making sure the Chesapeake Bay is safe. Or they're at dealing with our customs, or money is going to University of Maryland, to Johns Hopkins, to not only help our veteran get new arms, but to get a new life. Isn't that what the people want? We can be more frugal. We have to be more sensible. But let's not do sequester. It's bad money, it's bad management, and we can do better. What we can't do is continue to delay and put the entire burden on discretionary spending. So let's stand up Let's be counted. Let's have a vote on Thursday, and I do hope that the Democratic alternative prevails. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from California.